On the 23rd of June, 1757, on a mango grove in Bengal, around 3,000 men of a trading company faced a royal army of 50,000. The company's commander was a former clerk named Robert Clive. He had a few cannon, a few hundred European troops in red coats, several thousand Indian sepoys, and a secret. By sunset, the largest army on the field had lost, and a trading company had taken its first kingdom. This is the story of how a firm that began by asking permission to sell pepper ended up ruling 60 million people without ever winning a single vote. Both sides. No verdict. We show you what happened, and you decide. When we left the East India Company at the end of the last episode, it was still a guest. India in the year 1700 was richer than all of Europe and produced close to a quarter of everything made in the world. The Mughal emperors who ruled it sat in the red sandstone halls of the Red Fort at the center of one of the great civilizations on Earth. The company was only a cluster of fortified trading posts on the coast, whitewashed warehouses behind low walls, polite and profitable and small. Then the empire that held India together began to crack. After 1707, the Mughal throne weakened. Provincial governors, the Nawabs, became kings in all but name. Persian and Afghan horsemen sacked Delhi and carried off its treasures on elephants. Into every crack in that old order, the company quietly poured men and muskets. It was never meant to have an army. A trading firm with soldiers is a strange and dangerous idea, but every warehouse needed guards, and guards became garrisons, and garrisons became regiments of Indian sepoys in red coats, drilled in the European fashion and paid from London. By the 1750s, the company could march tens of thousands of trained soldiers onto a field. Without anyone in Parliament quite deciding it, a business had become one of the largest military powers in India. An army in search of a reason. The man who would light the fuse was Robert Clive, and he is hard to love and hard to dismiss. He had arrived in India as a bored, quarrelsome young clerk who, the story goes, once tried to take his own life and survived only when the pistol failed to fire. He turned out to have a cold genius for war and an even colder one for money. Brilliant, ruthless, and never satisfied, he was the kind of man the empire would produce again and again. A hero in the drawing rooms of London, and something very different in the villages of Bengal. The reason came in Bengal, the richest province of them all. Its young Nawab, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, watched the company strengthen the walls of its fort at Calcutta and decided to stop it. He took the city. The company sent Clive to take it back. But Clive did not really win Bengal in battle. He won it with a bribe. Before a single shot mattered at Plassey, he had already bought the Nawab's own army commander, Mir Jafar, with the promise of the throne. When the fighting began, a monsoon downpour soaked the Nawab's gunpowder, while the company kept its own cannon dry under canvas. Mir Jafar's enormous wing of the army simply sat on its horses and watched. By evening, the young Nawab was in flight, soon to be murdered, and Clive had placed his bought man on the throne of Bengal. To the directors in their candlelit hall in London, it was the deal of the century. To Bengal, it was the day a foreign company began choosing its kings. What followed was not trade, it was extraction. The new puppet Nawab emptied his treasury, in chests of silver coin, into company hands. Clive himself took a private fortune so vast it would shock even the men who had sent him. The officers had a phrase for it. They called it shaking the pagoda tree, and they shook it hard. Clerks who had sailed out with nothing sailed home as some of the richest men in Britain. The wealth of Bengal moved down the river to the coast and into the holds of three-masted wooden East Indiamen, their sails bound for London. That silver did not sit quietly in strong boxes. The new fortunes came home and bought their way into Britain itself. The nabobs, as the newspapers mocked them, purchased great country houses, married into old families, and bought seats in the candlelit Parliament at Westminster. The men who profited from the company were now also the men meant to govern it. a private interest had grown rich enough to buy a share of the very state that was supposed to watch over it. It was an old trick dressed in silk, and powdered gentlemen would play it again in every century that followed. Some tried to resist. In 1764, a combined army of the Mughal emperor and 2 Nawabs, thousands of horsemen and foot soldiers under silk banners, met the company's redcoats and sepoys at Buxar, determined to undo Plassey. They lost. The following year, in 1765, the Mughal emperor himself, now nearly powerless on his throne, pressed his seal in wax onto a single sheet of paper that changed the shape of the world. He granted the company the Diwani, the legal right to collect the land taxes of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Read that again. A company run from a narrow London street was now the official tax collector and the real government for roughly 20 million people in the villages and fields of Bengal. It held no crown. It answered to no voters. It governed with an army, a treaty, and a ledger. Then came the reckoning. In 1769, the monsoon rains failed across Bengal, and the fields cracked dry under the sun. The company, now the government, kept sending its tax collectors on horseback anyway. In places, it raised the demand. Its agents hoarded grain in locked warehouses to keep the price high. The Great Bengal Famine of 1770 killed perhaps 10 million people, close to a third of the province, the dead lying in the lanes of villages while the granaries stayed shut. In those same years, the company's shareholders gathered in London and still expected, and still received, their dividend. Here, the ledger sits at its most brutal. One of the worst famines in recorded history, and in a paneled counting house, clerks in powdered wigs balanced the company's leather ledgers by candlelight straight through it. Both of those things are true at the same time, and neither one cancels out the other. When Clive was finally hauled before Parliament to answer for the wealth he had carried home, he did not apologize. Shown the sheer scale of his fortune, he told the members that he stood astonished at his own moderation. He was cleared. Within 2 years, he was dead by his own hand. The empire would keep his methods and quietly forget his name. Then something happened that should sound very familiar. The company that had drained a province nearly went bankrupt itself. It had borrowed and spent and assumed the silver would simply keep coming. When it stumbled in 1772, the moneylenders and merchants of Georgian London, in their frock coats and tricorn hats, realized the firm had grown too large to be allowed to fall. Its collapse would drag down half the coffee houses of the city and half of Parliament with it. So the British state stepped in with a rescue, the first great corporate bailout, and in exchange began, at last, to bring the company under government control. A private firm with its own army. A rescue because it had grown too big to fail. Profits kept private, and the losses handed to the public. None of this was new even then. We only find the original, and still both sides of the ledger refuse to be separated. The same company rule that bled Bengal also laid the first surveyed roads, built the first courts and revenue offices, the machinery that would one day harden into a state. The same trade that filled London's drawing rooms with Indian cotton and Chinese tea broke the very weavers at their wooden looms who had made that cotton famous. To a shareholder in London, Bengal was the finest investment on earth. To a farmer in its villages, it was the year the rain failed and the tax collector still rode up the lane. Both are true. By 1765, the experiment was complete. A company had become a country. It had learned the lesson that would define the next 100 years. You do not always need to conquer a land with a flag. Sometimes it is enough to buy its rulers, collect its taxes, and keep its account books. For the next century, that single company would rule more people than any kingdom in Europe, until the day the soldiers who had built its power, the sepoys themselves, turned their muskets around. In the next episode, a rumor about greased cartridges runs through the company's own army, and in the summer of 1857, the whole of northern India rises in revolt. This was part 2, The Conquest. Subscribe and travel forward through the empire with us.